With the question of property, I think the differences become a bit more distinct. I think they become quite a bit more distinct. So in the question of property, here are some of the questions we might ask. Should individuals own private property? Is private property a natural right? Private property ownership a natural right? Is private property even a valid theological category? And then, if property ownership is a valid category, what limits, if any, should be placed on property ownership? Should the church have a role in limiting or redistributing property ownership? Should the state have a role in limiting or redistributing property ownership? Now, you should notice that these questions tie directly to the broad questions of justice that we were asking in our lecture on church and state. Remember that there are a number of different forms of justice, and one of those forms of justice is distributive justice. And that asks this question of how should scarce resources be distributed? Now, I mentioned just there, how should scarce resources be distributed? So classical economic theory, modern economic theory, thinks of resources as scarce. I have here my copy of our textbook. This is my copy. It's one individual copy. This resource in and of itself is scarce. There's only so many copies of this book available. If I destroy this book, it's gone, right? It's used up. If I give it to you, you have it, and I don't. Now, I can go buy another copy, right? But then I have to spend some other resources, some of my money, to buy another copy. The supply isn't infinite. If the supply is not infinite, then there's going to be some level of demand, right? And here we have the laws of supply and demand, and it's going to be worth a certain amount of money. That's, in many ways, a metaphysical claim, and in many ways, a theological claim. So, of course, when you look at something like an individual copy of a textbook, and a printer has so many copies and so much ink and so much paper, we can kind of easily see that as a discrete thing, this can be scarce. But overall, is there scarcity? Do we live in a condition of scarcity, or do we live in a condition of abundance? So that will be a distinction. Some who emphasize a strong sense of rights and private property will say that in the current state in which we live, whether it's just looking at nature or whether it's looking through a theological lens at the doctrine of the fall, it's characterized by at least some degree of scarcity. Resources are not limitless. Others, from other perspectives, might say, but the doctrine of creation tells us that we live in a condition of abundance, that God has supplied and will supply everything that we need to survive. The question isn't whether we have enough to survive and even to thrive. The question is, are some people taking far more than they need and thereby leaving others with not enough? Those are interesting theological questions that we can think about. Okay, so on this question of private property rights, universal ethics tends to suggest that there is some kind of natural right to hold private property, or at least some kind of practical right that allows for private property ownership within kind of the current age in which we live. And a great example of this is one of our key figures in universal ethics, which is Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas suggests that whether or not there was natural property in the Garden of Eden, we're not in Eden anymore. And to effectively be able to allocate and divide resources, there is some degree of scarcity. So having some rights in private property makes sense. In the modern Enlightenment context, we can look at a figure like John Locke, who very much informs, I think, a lot of aspects of modern Anglo-American property law, which says that people have a natural right to own property because in the state of nature, property is undeveloped. But once a human being adds labor to that property, does something productive with it, they've added something to it, like you've planted a garden that didn't exist before, then you have a natural right to that. So that's a universal way to think about private property rights. From a subversive perspective, there's going to be a lot of skepticism and criticism about private property rights, or at least about the scope of private property rights. And there's going to be very often kind of a historical critique of the way private property rights have been owned and the way private property rights have been used, again, by kind of the wealthy elite interests in society to accumulate far more than they need and to exclude others from what they basically need to get by. So from the universal perspective, there are going to be questions about allocation and distribution, but as we'll see in a moment, very often many of those questions are going to be left to how markets, how private transactions will allocate and distribute, perhaps with something left over, a role left over for church or for state to provide a safety net. From a subversive perspective, there's going to be a much stronger sense very often that the state and or the church ought to have a more direct role in redistributing claimed private property rights and in equalizing the playing field. I think this question of property ownership from the ecclesial perspective is a really interesting one, and at least for me, I think it's a place that it really puts some tension on ecclesial ethics. And the text mentions this a little bit and talks about, ecclesial ethicists will often first say, well, let's not look at the way these things ought to work in the broader society first. Let's ask first, what kind of community ought the church to be? And if we look at the kind of community throughout Scripture that God's people are supposed to be, and then in particular in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, in the epistles, in the Gospels, how the church is supposed to be, certainly within and among each other, we're supposed to be free with our goods. We're supposed to provide for each other if we really love each other. We ought not to have people within our own communities who are in serious lack because we can provide for them. And all of that is, of course, strongly biblical and true and good. The question is, how does that translate to any kind of broader ethic? And maybe it doesn't. Some ecclesial ethicists will say, in a sense, it doesn't because, let's just be the example that we can be as the church. My question back would very often be, but the kind of distribution of goods within the church still presumes some idea, some philosophical idea about property rights and ownership, and also presumes some kind of legal idea. Because even within the church, if I'm going to say, I own this and I will give it to you out of charity, I'm still saying I own this. I have a legal right. I have some kind of moral right. So in a sense, I think it begs the question. But I think it's one of those very interesting questions where these different schools of thought, again, kind of bump up against each other and maybe even in some ways blend together to think it through. Another key piece of property, which we're going to talk about toward the end of the semester, is how does property ownership relate to care for creation? I'm not going to spend really much time talking about this point in this lecture because we're going to have 2 whole classes on this. But I just want to highlight it now because, again, we're talking about resource use and resource allocation. I mentioned before, I'm holding my book. I can, legally and under American law, I can do what I would like with this book. I can't make a copy of it. That'd be a copyright violation, but I can discard it. I can throw it away. I can sell it to somebody else. I can waste it if I want to. And, on a very small scale, that would be a waste, but it, wouldn't be a sort of terrible global tragedy. But when you do have resources that can be used up, we call those in economic terms rivalrous resources. And when you think about things like the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, to a certain extent, certainly on a local level, those are rivalrous resources. There's only so much clean air, only so much clean water, and so on in the environment that we inhabit. Even though the globe is huge, There's a lot of people in the world, right? So the question of who owns a piece of land and can you just pollute it if you want to, and how does that affect other people, right? All those questions will relate to both property ownership and care for creation, and we'll talk about that in detail toward the end of the semester.